Welcome everyone, Kostin here with a discussion about Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires to talk about the races that are in the most desperate need of a rework. The Chaos Dwarf Edition, which has certainly highlighted the lackluster nature of certain races in the game as they currently are. Now, a race that constantly gets mentioned in the comment section by people when it comes to races that need a rework is Bretonnia. Now, I don't think Bretonnia is as bad as some people make it out to be, but they certainly do have their issues. Now, I focus a lot on the campaign situation, the strategic situation, the growth, the income, and Bretonnia certainly has good growth. They have good early game artillery options, they have good hero choices, they have plenty of good cavalry choices, but obviously they're lacking in the infantry side. The problem with lacking in infantry is that when your entire infantry line, with the exception of foot squires and battle pilgrims, is bad, then it makes taking sieges a hell of a situation. Bretonnia's problems is that even with artillery, it is difficult to win siege battles against a determined opponent. So if there's a full stack of enemy troops defending provincial capital, it is going to be very difficult for Bretonnia to dislodge them in a single battle. That's because while they do have some units that are good at it, like flying cavalry units, things like rail guardians, questing knights, they're just lacking in the ability to win. They also have issues with the vows, limiting their hero potential, and also tying upkeep of those powerful knightly units to certain vows is a major problem that limits their campaign. But good growth, good economy, and of course good cavalry choices, and also good artillery choices like Blessed Field Trebuchets and Field Trebuchets are really good artillery units that can do very well in sieges in particular. So I think Bretonnia does have some issues. They do need some updates, but I don't think they need a rework so much. But plenty of people disagree. I thought I'd mention it. I do see certainly some issues that they can improve on. Like, Bretonnia's issue is in a lot of ways similar to the Imperial issue in that their infantry line just sucks until you get to a high enough tier, and even then it's only decent, it isn't great. At number 5, we have Kislev. Now, Kislev has a huge number of issues, though quite a few of those issues actually come down to the design of Kislev itself. See, Kislev has these major cities, Kislev, Prague, Arengrad, that are very important cities because of all the special structures they provide, all the landmarks, so to speak, that they provide. That's all well and good, but these cities can't generate enough income to keep your armies going. I mean, you'll be able to maintain 1-2 stacks, full stacks, pretty decent units, but not necessarily more than that, even if you control all of them, because obviously once you start getting good units, the upkeep will rise. And that's basically all that Kislev as an entire territory offers to the 3 big cities, because all the minor settlements over here, Troll Country, the Western Oblast, the Eastern Oblast, the Southern Oblast, they're very limited in economy because they don't have a provincial capital. Now, Kislev can generate a lot of money because their main income building in the settlements outside of the Kislev cities, the big Kislev cities themselves, can generate a lot of trade resources, but you need a provincial capital for that. Kislev also has advantages in the fact that their armored units, armored Cossars, Tsar Guard, Bear Riders, regular Cossars, they're all pretty good units, and you have a great deal of casualty replenishment. You also have some decent magic choices. Not the best magic in the world, but decent enough. So all that's good, but they really suffer from the design of Kislev as a territory on the campaign map. I think there needs to be some redesign in the terrain here. Terrain does matter a lot in a campaign. Now, on top of that, they have the annoyance, especially in Castalton and Catherine's campaign, though Boris also suffers from this, the annoyance of the devotion system. See, Kislev is seemingly balanced around keeping some of these invocations active, but these invocations cost devotion, and devotion cost goes up the more territory you hold. So if you have a massive empire in the campaign map, the cost is going to be enormous, and you only gain devotion from fighting the forces of chaos. If the cost was flat, like the regular rights are for virtually every other race, it wouldn't be so much of an issue. But it isn't a flat cost, it is a significantly increasing cost in your campaign. What's also annoying is that for Catherine and Castalton, they require 600 supporters just to achieve their short campaign victory condition. If it was long, that would be a different discussion, but it's short, which is ridiculous. There's a lot of races and factions and legendary lords that have really horrible even short campaign or long campaign victory conditions, and Kislev is certainly part of that. I mean, Boris' campaign works because he ignores the supporter system, or he can ignore the supporter system. You also have a much better short campaign victory condition requirement in order to win his particular campaign. On top of that, Kislev's baseline economy, with the exception of like them getting a lot of trade resources and that buffing their economy a lot, just doesn't work very well. See, the way Kislev's economy is that trade resources give you a small but overall significant economic benefit because it's stacked. So you're increasing your economy with every trade resource that you get. But that means Kislev's economy starts very weak and only becomes stronger much later on when you build a massive empire. Now, Kislev does have scalability. This is an important factor. They do start out weak, they do start out with a lot of issues, but if you take all of these trade resources, you can end up having significant advantages in your campaign. But what's also ridiculous about Kislev, I think, is that the best campaign plan for them is to actually conquer the empire. For instance, like taking over the Ostermark, taking over Sylvania, Talabeclan, Midland, gives them a lot of benefits in their campaigns because that's where all the resources is. Kislev's campaign shouldn't be fought in Kislev or the Chaos Wastes. It just won't work in a lot of ways if you try and do that. Like if you're playing with Boris Ursus, you can conquer the Darklands and that will work pretty well for you. But yeah, limitations in their campaign, bad campaign design, just a horrible geographic position. And while they have some good units, they also have issues in battles as well. Siege tactics, your ability as a faction to win siege battles is actually important because there's going to be a lot of those in a campaign. And Kislev only gets artillery and it only has one artillery unit at tier 4. Now Lil Grom is really good for siege battles, but it's kind of useless in field battles. So there's a problem there as well. I think Kislev would really benefit from having like a tier 2 toolmaker that would give them some artillery option that would be effective in sieges. Without that, they're going to suffer a lot, and it leads to a pretty horrible design when it comes to, or a horrible siege situation, because you can't send your melee units through the gates unless you have a full melee stack. You can't afford the full melee stack as Kislev. While it will be effective, the cost will be insane. And so you're going to have a hybrid army as Kislev, right? Range units, melee units. And the thing is, while your range units can kill things beyond the walls, actually moving behind the walls will be a problem in a lot of situations, again, that's dedicated to defender. Like if Frot has a full stack and help it, it's going to be a brutal situation to take help it in the campaign, especially early on. It's much better for Boris Ursus, who starts with a very significant amount of power in his own army, but Kislev as a race is poorly designed. Boris has a great deal of power, so you have that kind of difference there. You can have legendary lords that are great and weak races that need a rework. And you can have really weak legendary lords for races that are some of the best in the game. Kislev is the kind of race that has two really bad legendary lords, and only one that's good, but the race itself is very, very weak. And number 4 is Norsca. Norsca has a pretty good roster of units. They have good hero choices as well available to them. Though some of those hero choices are locked behind tier 4, you do want the Femir Balefiend in order to get the replenishment. And a lot of their units, while certainly good when you're fighting the battle manually, a lot of their units, especially their early game infantry units, while they're certainly good in battle, they will struggle a lot in auto-resolve, and having a poor auto-resolve result can be pretty frustrating when you're dealing with the campaign. But the issue of units is actually the least of the problems that Norsca does have. Their campaign mechanics don't work particularly well. Let me explain. So Norsca's economy on land is pretty horrible. They do generate a lot of their income from ports, but here's the problem with income from ports. Ports are vulnerable. The AI may not march across half the world to attack you via land, but they will march half across the ocean to attack you via sea. And that is obviously something that creates a major vulnerability for Norsca when it comes to defense. So they're pretty bad at defending territory. And since their economy is all based on ports, you can imagine how many issues that creates. Now, Norsca does have a good amount of income they can earn from sacking settlements, but this is where we get into probably the biggest issue, as I see it for Norsca. Norsca wants to appease the various chaos gods for major benefits in their campaign. In particular, the Serpent's favor can give you a fairly substantial benefit over here because of the Lord recruit rank. So yeah, Tzeentch is the guy you probably want to go for, though obviously other factions are pretty good as well. Like Nurgle is really good with the casualty replenishment. Khorne isn't necessarily too bad either, but really you do want to go for the Serpent. Or I'm not sure if that's Tzeentch or Sinnelleos. I might be getting that a bit wrong. A bit confusing with the different names. Either way, you want to get favor with the gods, but how do you get favor with the gods? Well, first you have to raise a settlement and raise it in the favor of that god. That means that a lot of the territory you're conquering on the campaign map is territory that is going to be burned to the ground, and then you either reestablish it or just leave it like that. The problem is, obviously, if you're trying to eliminate the faction, just burning their territory to the ground may not work because they will take it over back again. On top of that, you're going to miss out on the sacking income if you're just raising settlements. You can't just sack a settlement and then raise it. You can't just sack a settlement and then get as much favor of the gods as you would have otherwise. So these two situations conflict greatly, since Norsca's economy does depend a lot on being able to get that sacking income, and because you're limited in how much you can sack, their economy is going to be weak. That means fewer armies, fewer troops running around, and it's not like Norsca is easy to defend. Norsca is a massive part of the map that's very vulnerable on all sides over here. A lot of factions will declare war on you. Fellow Chaos factions will declare war on you. The Order factions will declare war on you. So Norsca is a nightmare to defend, and you just don't have the troops to do so. On top of that, Norscan factions do hate each other. Yes, you have the Confederation mechanic that allows you to beat up the leader of another faction and take their territory. But grats, you just gain territory to defend, even more territory to defend, and your economy might start going in the red very, very quickly because of the territory. Especially if factions start sacking your settlements and you end up losing money every single turn. So there's a lot of issues with Norsca. I mean, if you can handle all of that, you can achieve a great deal of power on your campaign map, but it's going to be a problem. On top of that, their monster hunts are bugged, because it's not just a quest battle. It's also a bunch of various objectives that you need to do. So for instance, there might be an objective to raid Mindenheim. Well, what if you just capture Mindenheim? Well, great, you just screwed yourself over there, right? Because you'll fail the objective, you'll fail the monster hunt. So it is bugged, it is unfinished, it doesn't work properly. I think you should be able to get favor from taking over settlements or just sacking them instead of just raising them to the ground. Raising settlements to the ground never worked well in Total War Warhammer, and having a faction that just relies on doing that for campaign resource doesn't end up going too well in your campaign. Even if you don't care about land territory, you're still going to be screwed because of that economy. Like, they changed it for Warriors of Chaos. They changed it for the Beastmen. I mean, the Beastmen are the only faction right now, the only race in the game right now, where raising settlements to the ground works for them. But bear in mind, they have the ability to prevent factions from resettling the territory that they just raised to the ground. That's kind of the difference. As Norsca, you're just left dealing with some of the worst of that situation. And that's, I think, one of the things that needs the most work done with them. They need better monster hunts. The monster hunts need to be fixed and changed. Their legendary lords and their starting situation could also be changed as well. Like, Trog is okay. Wulfric, however, has a horrible starting situation over here because he can only recruit weak marauders early on. You start with a good army as Trog. You start with a pretty horrible situation as Wulfric. Even though I guess Wulfric could be considered the better lord with his various benefits, though the troll benefit that Trog gets can also be very, very substantial. They also don't even have the best trolls in the game. Like, Norscan ice trolls, yeah, they're okay. They're not going to hold a candle to stone trolls or armored chaos trolls. That's another issue as well. At number 3, we have the Daemons of Chaos. Personally, I would probably put this faction at number 1 on this list, but hey, people vote the way they do. And I don't necessarily disagree with the choices that people voted as the top ones, because they desperately need work. But the Daemons of Chaos, and here I'm not just talking about the Demon Prince, I'm talking about all of them. Skarbrand, Kugaf, Kairos, Nakari, they all have horrible campaigns in one way or another. You can make Nakari and Skarbrand work pretty good in your campaign. Like, when Nakari can conquer all of Ulthuan very, very quickly. I've done that. I've played that campaign. It was a lot of fun actually making that work. But there's obviously significant issues. What are the problems with the Demons of Chaos? What are the problems with all the demonic factions? Well, their economy is very, very weak to begin with. And they all rely on gimmicks in their campaigns, or mechanics, if you will, to get a good amount of power. In the case of Nakari, it's vassalization, seductive influence. In the cults, in the case of Skarbrand, it's the Blood Host. In the case of Kugaf, it's the Plagues. In the case of Tzeentch, in the case of Kairos, it's the Changer of Ways. What that means really is Nakari and Skarbrand are good. Nakari especially is the strongest demonic faction in the game by far. Like, Nakari can take over the entire world and not really lift a finger to have to do that. But the problem is the baseline faction, the demonic faction, because they're all based on the demonic faction. It's not like there's 5 different factions. No, there's basically one faction that they split off into sub-factions. That's what the Demons of Chaos are. They're sub-factions, like Kugaf gets plagues, etc. And the problem is relying on mechanics and gimmicks when your faction itself is inherently weak means you are inherently weak as a race on the campaign map. So I think that what Creative Assembly should do when they do decide to rework the Demons of Chaos, or when they decide to release DLC, because I don't expect reworks to be made for free. I expect reworks to be part of a Lord pack or something larger than that. It was pretty disappointing that they didn't include a rework for a particular race with the Forge of the Chaos Dwarves, but that's a different discussion. But it likely will be part of a Lord pack to improve the race. So I don't expect it for free, but I think the Demons of Chaos need a stronger baseline economy and not so much of reliance on those gimmicks on their campaign mechanics. Because as Scarbrand, yeah, the Blood Hosts are nice, but you know what's nicer? Actually having proper bloody armies with replenishment in your campaign, like the Beastmen do, as an example, or the Warriors of Chaos do. Valkia is so far ahead of Scarbrand, it's not even funny in her campaign. I mean, Scarbrand can get a lot faster around the campaign map. Valkia will build a massive gargantuan empire that can't be beaten. Scarbrand, you might have a couple of settlements, then and he's not generating any money, so he's very vulnerable. Like, you lose a battle as Scarbrand's campaign over. You can lose 100 battles as Valkia and still win the campaign with ease. That's the critical element. The amount of effort it takes to win a demonic campaign is enormous compared to many other races in the game. And it's because, again, they're reliant on those mechanics, they're reliant on those gimmicks, and they just don't have anything to back them up at the end of it. Like, Nakari is the best because Nakari actually has a decent enough economy, though it's not a great economy. Some people are like, Nakari has a good economy. No, it's decent. It gets the job done, but it's not a great economy. And besides, Nakari only gets away with that particular impression because you can vassalize factions and get their economy to support yours, not because you are generating a lot of money for your settlements. Compare that to Warriors of Chaos, who can both generate a lot of money directly and also have the vassal tribute. There is no contest. Like Warriors of Chaos, the Warriors of Chaos, the Champion of Chaos DLC, just put all the demonic factions so far behind it's not funny. I mean, the demonic factions were already pretty weak in Realms of Chaos compared even to like Kislev or Cafe. They were far weaker, had a lot of issues there, and we just see this being crystallized in Immortal Empire. So they need better economies, they need a better campaign situation. And it's kind of funny that Demons of Chaos are the worst faction, the worst race in the game by far, and that's even with the Champions of Chaos DLC helping to fill a lot of their unit roster gaps that they had. Imagine without the Champions of Chaos how terrible these guys would be. And number 2, we have the Empire. The Empire has been one of the weakest factions in the game for a fairly long time and certainly have been left behind. The reality is Creative Assembly improves factions with DLCs, improves races with DLC, and the Empire hasn't gotten a paid DLC for a long time, and the improvements they got with the Beast and the Hunter DLC just weren't that great. That introduced the Imperial Authority system, which is a pretty bad system. I think I speak for a lot of people where the previous system that we had was actually better. I know, it sounds shocking that they improved the race, quote-unquote, and actually made the situation worse. Let me explain what the issue is with Imperial Authority. I know this doesn't affect every faction and every legendary lord in the Empire, but let's not talk about the Hunts Marshal and how garbage his campaign mechanic is with the hostility meter. I mean, it's great in a way because you get a lot of those endgame units pretty quickly, but having a Doomstack spawning every now and then in your core territory isn't necessarily fun and will obviously limit your campaign. But here's the problem. So if you're playing as Karl Franz or Gelt, you have to care about the whole state of the Empire. The problem is, many of these factions over here, like Ostermark, Hochland, are marked for removal by other factions. Like, Hochland will always be destroyed by Festus, Ostermark will always be destroyed by Drycut, Blackland will struggle as well, Kislev may wipe out Ostland. And that already is a significant problem, and you don't have the tools to really defend the entire empire. Like, look at the Chaos Dwarf situation. I think the Forge of the Chaos Dwarves really showed how you can make a campaign and make campaign mechanics where legendary lords care about the welfare of their entire race, not just their own selfish struggles. See, if you're playing a Chaos Dwarf Legendary Lord, you do want the other Legendary Lords to do well. You don't care about like the servants of the conclave. Well, you do, but they'll be fine. You don't care about this minor cast faction, but you do care about the state of like the Drazov and Zaytan if you're playing as Astrogoth. The reason is because of the Tower Czar system, the influence system that they have, which is a much better way, because you'll obviously unlock significant faction benefits. You'll all unlock significant faction benefits if you control the military districts, but the seats can be hard to take on your own. But other factions can take individual seats and unlock the district benefits. And eventually you get the ability of confederating with the other legendary lords of the Chaos Dwarves, giving you a lot of campaign power. Especially if they've done well, because that means the AI is spending resources to upgrade the settlements, build the settlements. In the Empire, you can confederate other factions you want to, obviously, but in comparison, yeah, you get some items, you get some state troopers, but the economic benefits, the territorial benefits are not worth squat. The Imperial factions just... The minor Imperial factions, like all minor factions, just won't build their territory very well. Whereas with the Chaos Dwarves, yeah, the Legendary Lords will build the territory better because they have more resources. So the Imperial factions are pathetic. They won't really give you much when you do confederate them. Hell, if you could conquer the Empire on your own, actually that would be a better situation because you'd get a lot of money in the process, experience with your troops, levels for your heroes and lords. That would actually end up working better for the Empire. So it's a pretty miserable, bad system. That's the first issue. That's one of the big things that needs to be reworked. Now, on top of that, the Empire has a good economy, but there's problems with their building structure. So to unlock many of the good units, you need to have like the armory, for instance, in order to unlock the ability for you to recruit that. So you need a bunch of different structures in territories in order to make that work. Their heroes also are pretty lackluster compared to other races because, well, they don't have a special skill line like many heroes for newer races do, so they're not really adding a bunch. Like a captain is just a melee hero. He's not going to give you anything really beyond that, well, in training, right? He's not going to give you, like, oh, you can customize a captain in some way to make ranged troops or melee troops better. That's not something you have in your campaign as dwarves. Their lords are better, sure, or rather some of their lords are better. Like Archlectors and Huntsmen can offer you a lot, though Huntsmen obviously suffer because ranged lords and heroes are not that great in the game right now in terms of their combat ability, but they can give you some army benefits. Like a Huntsman General does have the skill line over here where you can get range for Huntsmen or bonus versus infantry or campaign movement range. Like something like this is what everyone else needs, right? What the other lords and the other heroes also need in their campaign. On top of that, their early game units are pretty trash. I mean, Imperial Knights and Pistoliers are decent enough, but Cavalry is not going to win you sieges. That's the problem, especially not these guys. They're just not that good compared to, say, what Bretonnia may get in their early game. I mean, these guys might beat Bretonnia, but keep in mind you don't have the massive growth or superb economy that Bretonnia has. Your growth is more limited. It's okay, but it's not fantastic. Bretonnia at least has that going for it. And on top of that, your other units are just absolute garbage. Like archers are worse than goblin archers. Swordsmen lose to many tier 1 infantry units. Spears and shields just won't handle themselves in a fight. Halberdiers are universally considered as one of the most useless units to ever recruit on the campaign map, and that's kind of sad because Halberdiers should be the mainstay of the Imperial Army, not the most useless unit that you can ever recruit. You do get better choices, decent choices at tier 3 with greatswords and huntsmen, but they're not going to compare to some of the heavier units that you're dealing with the campaign. These guys will do decently against Chaos Warriors, but they more often than not will lose, and they're pretty much the same tier. In fact, you can get Chaos Warriors much earlier and much easier than these guys if you're playing a Warriors of Chaos campaign or even a Demonic campaign. The Empire does have good artillery choices in terms of their power, but the artillery is also locked behind tier 4, not tier 3. The mortars are garbage because the AI dodges the shot, so you have to expend a great deal of effort in that to make that work. War wagons are worthless. Yes, Hellstorms and war wagons with mortars, now that's a great deal of ability because mobility, right? And great cannons, they're all good. Siege tanks and Hellbasters can be good, but they're locked behind tier 5. If you had the growth of Bretonnia, sure, it would not necessarily be the same problem, but you don't have the growth that Bretonnia has. When the free LC faction gets that much better growth in economy than you, it's kind of sad and pathetic for the Empire, really, in a lot of ways. And a lot of the units just are not great. Like the Empire, the only strength of the Empire is their cavalry line. They actually have one of the best cavalry lines in the entire game. But their artillery is locked behind too many tiers. Like if you could move great cannons to like tier 3, or hell, make them tier 2, buff up mortars, make gunpowder units better, give us a higher tier infantry unit that you can use in the late game, buff the early game units, like move great swords from tier 3 to tier 2. It would do so much in an Imperial campaign, and remove the armory requirement. That would do so much in an Imperial campaign to actually improve their situation, because right now the early game of the Empire in every campaign, with the exception of Marcus Wolfhard, is a pretty miserable affair. Now, some people that play on lower difficulties may not understand why that's going to matter, because they're going to, you know, spend a lot of turns with dead time. But if you're playing on a high difficulty especially, it's like the first 20-30 turns are the most important part of your campaign, where you're going to fight the majority of the hardest battles in your campaign. And the Empire, ignoring the Imperial authority, ignoring the issues that causes, ignoring the issues of having to defend the Empire without the tools to do so, and without even reason to do so. You're not doing it because you're getting rewards. You're doing it because you don't want to get a civil war on your hands. That's a crap reason, by the way. Ignoring all those issues, the Imperial early game is one of the most miserable in the game. Say what you will about demons, they're demons, right? Bloodletters will chew up many early game infantry units very effectively. At Siege, Slaanesh, you will obviously you can get Forsaken that can get the job done. Nurgle has a lot of issues, but Nurgle has some very durable, strong early game units. Speed is a problem, but with the Champions of Chaos, the Warriors of Chaos DLC rework, they actually end up in a lot better situation. But the Empire has squat. What do you get? Swordsmen, spearmen with shields, archers, and crossbowmen. They're not horrible units, but they are far behind compared to other races that you're dealing with. An Imperial campaign is not sunshine. It's not like you're dealing with weak races. In fact, the Empire, if you're playing any other race in the game, the vast majority of the other races in the game, you want to conquer the Empire because it's the easiest thing you can do in your campaign. Like a huge gap, a huge amount of territory that's good, offers significant economic potential, that's defended by weak, pathetic factions that have a bad unit roster. Yeah, that's free real estate. No campaign that starts near the Empire has any difficulty. Like if you're playing as Festus, you'll just steamroll everything. If you're playing as Kislev, you'll steamroll the Empire. If you're playing as Vlad, you'll steamroll the Empire. If you're playing as Draika, well, you're in an endgame crisis, basically. That's the issue. The Empire is supposed to be the most powerful nation in the world, and they are not at all represented in the game in that respect. I mean, there's obviously political divisions, there's issues, etc. But the Empire, despite that, still is the most formidable nation in the world, going toe-to-toe against Chaos and winning more often than not. It was only for the bullshit of the end times that they lost, but really the Empire should be a lot more powerful and a lot better. Now, I would expect them to do a rework. They should do a rework if they ever get around to adding Vultan in the game, and Luthor Huss. But I guess we'll see if that ends up happening. And finally, and number one, is the regular Dwarves in the game. Not the Chaos Dwarves, who are an excellent race, but the regular Dwarves. They're pretty horrible to play in a lot of ways. They're actually pretty boring to play in a campaign. And the reason is, you don't really get the ability to experiment with a lot of different units. If you're playing the Chaos Dwarves or other races, Warriors of Chaos, for instance, Greenskins, you have a lot of flexibility in what you can recruit because a lot of things will work. As the Dwarves, a lot of things won't work. Not because the units themselves won't win battles, but because of their campaign mechanics. So the Dwarven roster has a bunch of melee units and artillery units that work well. They are really good in artillery because they get grudge throwers from tier 2. Although certainly some of their higher end artillery is not necessarily the best in game, but they do very well. Their hero choices are also pretty great. They do get special skill lines. They do add a lot of variety in different playstyles. Let me explain why this breaks down very, very quickly. The Dwarves have no way to improve casualty replenishment with the exception of a research that's fairly far in. And you're not just going to rush for Recite Ancient Grudges. You're going to want to get High King Authority. You're going to want to get the range benefits here. And then, obviously, you will start getting Recite Ancient Grudges. Now, the problem with poor casualty replenishment is that they can't easily recover from one battle to another. And there's a lot of battles to be fought in Immortal Empires from one turn to another. It also means you're fighting a lot of battles manually. So this pushes you as the player to adopt a playstyle that actually just works the best. The best Dwarven army is one made up of quarrelers and artillery. Nothing else is important. I mean, maybe a ranger playstyle, absolutely, though that will be worse in auto-resolve, but a ranger playstyle with a feign that gives them snipe can work very well. Don't get me wrong on that. But basically, most of your early game and most of your campaign, you're going to get a lot of quarrelers. And that means they're fairly one-dimensional in their army playstyle on the campaign map. They're not the only race that's like this, but the dwarves certainly have it the worst when it comes to... And that's because of the low casualty replenishment. Their grudge system is an abomination to deal with in a campaign, because you obviously have your initial grudges. When Immortal Empires came out, the grudge severity would go so high that you would pretty much spend the entire campaign at an enraged level, or a very good portion of your campaign at the enraged level, with the exception of Grombrindle, who could remove those grudges relatively quickly, quote-unquote, in 30 turns or so. But for the rest of them, especially Forik, it was horrible. Now, that's been fixed, but it's still annoying. Oh, a faction comes into my territory in raiding stance, I get a grudge. Not against them, not against the faction that just did that. They might be wiped out that same turn. That's not the problem. But you get, let's say, Greenskins raid your territory, you get the grudge against Greenskins. And it's not like a one-time thing. You have to... you'll keep getting grudges again and again and again throughout the campaign. It is sensical, but it's also annoying as all hell, because it means your grudge meter will fill up. And you might end up running out of those factions, out of those races to deal with. I think what would be a lot better with the grudge is, like, if a particular faction hurts you, you have to hurt that particular faction. If they get wiped out, so for instance over here, if the Greenskins and the Creepy Nef did an action against me, I get the grudge against them. And if they get completely removed from the campaign map, then the grudge should be resolved, because they got wiped out, right? And if you were the one that killed them, you should get the rewards. There's a lot of problems with getting the rewards in the first place. Like with the Master and the Spite, you actually... It says to win 5 battles, but if the 5th battle wipes out Scarsonic's faction, you're not going to fill the grudge. You're not going to fulfill the grudge. It will be removed, but you're not going to get the rewards. So it is annoying as hell to end up dealing with these grudges. And the rewards they give are kind of pathetic as well. Beyond that, while the dwarves can get a pretty decent economy, and it does scale very well in the end game, the early game economy is weak because their economy structures are very expensive. Greens can spend a quarter of the money and get more money than you. Think on that. The Greenskin economy is substantially better than dwarves. Now, if you get a lot of trading partners, if you're playing a campaign for a long time, it will work. But early on is misery, and as I said, early game situation is most important. On top of that, your growth is pathetic. With the exception of like special settlements like Karazak, the growth the dwarves have in their settlements is pretty weak. Now, the problem with growth is that it means you have less building slots. Less building slots means less unit recruitment types, means less economic might. So you already have to spend a lot for the buildings in general as the dwarves. You can reduce the cost by a very substantial amount, sure, with a certain lord trait and with a certain skill, but it's still pretty damn expensive, unless you get a lot of those lords to reduce it to basically 0. But dwarves have already fairly expensive structures, and now that you'll have fewer of them, so your recruitment potential is limited, your hero recruitment capacity is limited, and your economic might is also limited throughout the entirety of the campaign. Having poor growth really limits your campaign in a way that takes a while to realize. Like, I've played entire campaigns as dwarves, as Thorgrim, as Grombrindle in Immortal Empires, and I can tell you, it is pretty horrible to know that I could be playing another race and I would be building something every turn and my economy would grow, my potential would be much higher. That's the thing, the dwarven potential, even if you're playing at the best possible level, is limited. Your army is strong, but you're probably going to have to fight a lot of battles manually because of the poor casualty replenishment. And mods can help, but they won't fix all of those problems. Like, there is a mod to give you a craftable casualty replenishment through the fort system. So there are solutions, but I think what the dwarves need is better unit diversity. Monstrous units especially could be useful. On top of that, what they also need is reasons to actually use those different units. Because right now, there is no reason whatsoever to go anything beyond Quarrelers and Artillery. It's just the best possible playstyle for every Dwarf Legendary Lord in the game at the moment. I mean, Grombrindle and Forik also get significant benefits for Quarrelers, so yeah, even worse than that. And if you're playing Ungrim, if you're playing Forgrim, you still want to get in Belegar, you still want to go for Quarrelers. I mean, as Belegar for his army, you can obviously go for Rangers, but that's just basically the replacement for Quarrelers. You're still going with that playstyle. And again, it's fairly one-dimensional, boring. And the Dwarves also suffer because these grudges can affect your control. Now, control affects growth even further, and control is also a major issue on a high difficulty. Dwarves are actually the only race, I think, in the entire game that really suffers from the difficulty penalty. So if you're playing Dwarves on Legendary, you actually suffer significantly more because rebellions aren't really a big factor here. And while certainly getting a high level of control can be beneficial in a lot of campaigns, it's not too big of a problem to play entire campaigns with a low level of control. Unless you're the Dwarves, because that affects your really piss poor growth by a fairly significant amount. Like a settlement can give you... You might have 0 growth in your territory. It's not like you need very little, you need quite a lot in order to grow your settlements to tier 5 in order to unlock those building slots. So significant problems in Dwarven campaigns as things currently stand, and they desperately need a rework. They've needed a rework for a very, very long time, and I think that the Chaos Dwarves are evidence of how you can do it. I'm just talking about issues of growth control, casualty replenishment. Those could be fixed with buffs. Hell, want to know why the Dwarves are great military allies and a powerful faction on Legendary? Because that's exactly what Legendary fixes. Like, it fixes casualty replenishment, growth, control. That's what the AI gets on those high difficulties. And thus the Dwarves can really unleash their might if they're controlled by the AI. But the Chaos Dwarves show how things could be substantially better. How you can have an economy, or you can have buildings not tied to growth at all. How your entire empire isn't limited by supply lines. How you can have a great deal of flexibility in your armies. A great deal of flexibility in settlement customization. All of which makes sense for the Dwarves. A great deal. Like, the Chaos Dwarves represent what the Dwarves should have been from day one, but have never been, and maybe they won't be. I'm not saying they should be a carbon copy of the Chaos Dwarves. I think they should have their own unique mechanics, but they desperately need a rework. Hopefully a paid DLC pack, Lord pack, that reworks them completely from the ground up with their economy, their buildings, their grudges, you name it. And that's all. Questin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.